Miles Alexander adjusted his blazer as he stepped into the cozy cafe in the heart of San Francisco. The faint hum of conversation, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. It should have felt familiar, relaxing, but today it felt suffocating. He scanned the room, his eyes falling on a woman sitting alone at the corner table. Sophie Carver. She was exactly as he'd been told, tall, with dark brown hair and an air of quiet dignity. Her gaze was focused on the notebook in front of her, pen in hand. She didn't look up when he approached, and for a brief moment, Miles hesitated. He wasn't used to hesitation. He'd always been the confident one, the one who knew what to say, how to make things work. But Sophie, she had an aura about her, a calm, composed energy that made him second-guess everything. Was she aloof, or was it just him? "Hi," he said, forcing a smile as he pulled out the chair across from her. "Miles." Sophie finally looked up, and their eyes met. For a moment, she said nothing. She didn't speak, just studied him with an intensity that made Miles feel like an open book. Then, without a word, she scribbled something on her notepad and slid it across the table. "Nice to meet you." Miles blinked. He hadn't expected this. A woman who wouldn't speak, who communicated only through writing. What was he supposed to say to that? His smile faltered slightly as he read the note. He glanced up, unsure how to proceed. I wasn't expecting this," he stammered, gesturing vaguely to her silence. His voice sounded harsher than he intended. It was as if the silence between them amplified the awkwardness of the situation. Sophie smiled faintly but didn't speak. She held the pen in her hand and scribbled again, passing the note over to him. "I don't speak, but I can listen. Can you?" The words hit him harder than he anticipated. There was something in her gaze that forced him to pause. Miles had always been the one to speak, quick with words, decisive with actions. But now, here, in front of this woman who communicated only in silence, he was suddenly aware of his own discomfort. She wasn't what he expected. She wasn't trying to impress him or placate him. She was just herself. And that was more unsettling than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the silence between them. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make things uncomfortable." Sophie didn't seem bothered. She simply picked up her cup of coffee, took a sip, and then returned her attention to her notebook. She seemed at ease, like silence was her natural state. Miles found himself fumbling for something to say. The small talk felt forced. He hadn't prepared for this. How do you converse when the person in front of you doesn't speak? When every word feels like an intrusion? Minutes passed. He watched Sophie, her eyes occasionally flicking to the door, but her posture remained calm, collected. She didn't seem to care about the social expectations he was struggling to meet, and that intrigued him. He leaned back in his chair, trying to relax. "So, what do you do?" he asked, the question hanging awkwardly between them. She didn't write immediately. Instead, Sophie placed her pen down and took a deep breath. Then she scribbled another note and passed it to him. "I paint. Art is the only way I speak." Miles stared at the note for a moment, absorbing the words. Art. That made sense. He had seen her name at a few gallery events, but he hadn't realized the depth of her craft. There was more to her than he had first assumed, and it made him feel a bit ashamed for reducing her to just a mute woman. He looked back at her. "That's amazing," he said, his voice more genuine this time. "I'm sure your art says a lot." Sophie smiled. It was small but sincere. The conversation was difficult, but it wasn't as bad as Miles had feared. There was something in the way she held herself that made him want to understand her better. And strangely, the silence between them began to feel less awkward. But then, just as he thought he was finding his footing, she picked up her notebook again, scribbling quickly. She slid it across the table one last time. "I prefer to let people speak for themselves. Let's see if you can do that." Miles laughed, surprised by the challenge. For the first time that afternoon, he felt like he could breathe. It was the beginning of something he didn't fully understand yet, but something about it felt right. Something about Sophie Carver made him feel like he had stepped into a new world, one where words weren't as important as he thought. The days following the cafe felt like a blur to Miles. He couldn't stop thinking about Sophie, about the note she had left him, and the strange yet undeniable pull she had on him. Her silence, her calm, her grace. It wasn't what he was used to. He spent the next few days trying to push her from his mind, but nothing worked. The more he tried to focus on work, the more he found himself wondering what she was doing, what she was thinking. It was on a quiet afternoon a few days later when he found himself back at that same cafe, half hoping to see her again. It was as if the universe had decided to answer his silent plea, because there she was, sitting at the same table, her notebook in front of her, a half-finished cup of coffee beside it. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to disturb her peace. But as he approached, Sophie looked up from her notebook, her eyes meeting his with that same steady gaze. There was no judgment, no discomfort, just calm. "Hey," he said, his voice softer this time. "Mind if I join you?" She smiled and gestured to the empty seat across from her. Miles sat down, and for a few moments neither of them spoke. He was becoming accustomed to the quiet, though it still felt like a challenge. It was hard for him to be around someone so still, so composed. It made him feel like he was the one who needed to adjust. Sophie picked up her pen and began writing. She slid the notebook toward him, and as he read the words, they hit him with a force he wasn't expecting. "I've been silent for so long, it feels like I'm fading, like no one truly sees me." His heart ached as he read the words. Sophie had been communicating more than she ever could with her silence, and it shook him. The woman in front of him, so composed, so beautiful, was carrying a burden he couldn't even begin to understand. He looked up at her, his voice shaky. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." She nodded as if she had anticipated his response. Then she reached for her pen again and wrote something else. "It's not about being seen by others. It's about seeing yourself." Miles swallowed, trying to process what she had just shared. It was the kind of statement that echoed in his mind long after the conversation had ended, a challenge to everything he had believed about success, power, and even love. "You're not fading, Sophie," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I see you." He meant it, but somehow the words felt insufficient. Sophie gave him a small smile, one that reached her eyes this time. It wasn't just a polite gesture, it was real. "I can't imagine what it's like," Miles said, his voice full of regret. "I don't know how you've done it. How do you keep going?" Sophie paused, her eyes turning downward. She was thinking, deciding whether to share more. Miles could see the weight of her thoughts. Then she wrote again and pushed the notebook toward him. "I don't have a choice. We don't always get to choose what happens to us, but we do get to choose how we react." Her words struck him harder than anything else had. Sophie wasn't just surviving, she was living, choosing to rise above her circumstances. And it was in that moment, as Miles stared at her words, that he realized how much he still had to learn from her. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said, a rawness in his voice he hadn't expected. "I've never really had to face anything like you have. But I want to understand, I want to learn." Sophie looked at him again, her gaze steady and unwavering. She didn't need words to convey the depth of her emotions. She simply nodded, as if accepting his vow to try, to be better. Miles felt something shift in him, something more than just admiration. It was respect, deep, raw respect for the strength she had shown, for the journey she had endured in silence, and for the first time he was ashamed of how easy he thought his life was. They sat in silence for a few moments longer, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. Miles finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I think you're the strongest person I've ever met." Sophie smiled softly, her eyes lighting up with a quiet, humble acknowledgement of his words. It wasn't the kind of breakthrough moment he'd expected, but in that small cafe, in the presence of this woman who had endured so much without ever asking for sympathy, Miles knew something was shifting within him, and he knew he was just beginning to understand the real meaning of silence. The art gallery was a stark contrast to the usual business meetings Miles attended. There was an air of quiet elegance, the walls lined with vivid paintings that spoke more than any corporate strategy meeting could. Miles had never been one for art, at least not in the way Sophie seemed to breathe it. Yet here he was, standing in the center of the gallery, trying to navigate through the crowd while keeping his eyes on Sophie, who stood in front of one of her larger pieces. Her paintings were different from the others. While most of the art on the walls felt cold and detached, Sophie's work was raw, emotional. Each brushstroke seemed to speak of a story, a quiet kind of pain, a search for healing. Miles couldn't tear his eyes away. The more he looked, the more he understood. Each piece was a window into Sophie's soul. Sophie caught his gaze from across the room, her lips curled into a small, shy smile. For a moment, the noise of the gallery seemed to fade as their eyes locked. Miles, who had been confident in boardrooms and meetings, now found himself unsure of what to say. Words seemed inadequate. He walked over to her, trying to mask the feelings of awe and admiration swelling inside him. "Your work, it's incredible," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. Sophie nodded, her expression unreadable. She picked up her notebook and quickly scribbled something down. She passed it to him. "Thank you. It's the only way I know how to speak." Miles read the note, feeling the weight of it. She had always been reserved, letting her art do the talking. But this moment, standing here with him in the gallery, felt like something more. She wasn't just letting her art speak. She was speaking to him in ways that words could never convey. Before Miles could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Quite the piece, isn't it?" A man in a sharp suit stood beside them, eyeing Sophie's painting with a cold, calculating expression. Miles recognized him immediately. Henry, one of Sophie's ex-business partners. He was the type of man who saw art as nothing more than an investment, something to be bought and sold. Sophie's body stiffened slightly. Her grip on her notebook tightened, but she said nothing. Henry, as if sensing the tension, looked at Miles. "Sophie's work is great, but it's always been, well, niche. Art like this doesn't really sell to the mainstream crowd." Sophie's face remained calm, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Miles noticed the change, the subtle shift in her demeanor. He could see her trying to hold it together. He didn't like it. He didn't like how easily Henry dismissed her passion, her soul, for the sake of money. "That's because it's not about the market," Miles said before he could stop himself. The words left his mouth before he had a chance to think about them. "It's about the message, the emotion. That's what makes it important." Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Miles's sudden defense of Sophie's art. "Well, I suppose we'll see how long that lasts," he said with a smirk, before walking away. Sophie stared at the floor, her grip still tight on her notebook. Miles could see her trying to stay composed, but he knew the comment had hit her harder than she was willing to admit. "I'm sorry about him," Miles said quietly, his words genuine. "He doesn't understand what you're doing here. What this," he gestured toward her painting, "means." Sophie glanced up at him, her expression softening. She then quickly wrote something down and handed him the note. "He's right in some ways. Art isn't always enough." Miles frowned. He could see the vulnerability in her words. For a moment, he was at a loss. How could anyone think that art, her art, wasn't enough? To him, it was everything. It was her voice, her way of being heard in a world that often overlooked people like her. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his, something that felt completely natural despite how new their relationship was. "I don't think you're wrong, Sophie. Your art, it's everything, and I see it. I see you." Her eyes softened, and for the first time that evening, she gave him a smile that reached her eyes. It was small, but it was enough. In that moment, Miles realized just how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just a woman with a talent for painting. She was someone who had built a world from her silence, her pain, her heart. Sophie squeezed his hand before pulling away and writing down another note. "Thank you. That means more than you know." And for the first time since he'd met her, Miles felt like he understood her, not just the surface, but the depth of who she was, the quiet strength that ran through everything she did. The gallery was still bustling around them, but in that moment, it was just the two of them. And Miles knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges they'd face, he was ready to stand by her side. The tension at the dinner table was palpable. Miles had invited Sophie to meet his family, but from the moment they entered the elegant, sprawling house in Silicon Valley, Sophie felt like she was in a foreign world. The grand chandelier overhead, the marble floors, the air of polished perfection, it all seemed so far removed from the quiet, simple life she had carved out for herself. As she stepped further into the foyer, Sophie felt her nerves tighten. She could already hear the muffled sounds of conversation coming from the dining room, but they didn't seem welcoming. They felt cold. "Don't worry," Miles whispered, his hand brushing against hers. "They're just like any other family. They'll warm up to you." Sophie forced a smile, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. She wasn't sure if it was the formality of the surroundings or the fact that her silence made her feel like an outsider, but she knew she'd have to fight hard to find her place here. This wasn't just any dinner. It was the kind of dinner where her every move would be analyzed, scrutinized. The expectations would be high, especially with Miles's family, who never seemed satisfied unless everything was perfect. As they walked into the dining room, Sophie immediately felt the weight of the gazes on her. Miles's father, David Alexander, stood from the head of the table, his sharply tailored suit only adding to the air of authority he exuded. He was the kind of man who commanded respect without saying a word. His eyes flicked over Sophie quickly, assessing her like she was some new acquisition, and then he offered a polite but stiff smile. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Sophie," David said, his voice smooth but distant. Sophie nodded, offering a brief smile in return, trying to keep her composure. She could feel the judgment in the air, even if it wasn't spoken aloud. She wasn't from their world. She didn't belong in this polished, perfect world of status and wealth. But she was here because of Miles, and she would endure whatever it took to show him she could handle this. They all sat down to dinner, the conversation flowing as seamlessly as the wine being poured. But the questions began before Sophie had even taken a bite. "So, Sophie," David began, his gaze unwavering, "how exactly do you make a living? You know, art is quite a niche field. I assume you've considered other avenues for success?" Sophie stiffened, the subtle insult hanging in the air like a dark cloud. She could feel Miles's hand on her knee under the table, a silent gesture of reassurance, but it did little to ease the knot in her stomach. I paint," Sophie wrote quickly on her notepad and slid it across the table to David. David looked at the note, raising an eyebrow. "Art, yes, I see." His tone remained polite, but it was clear he wasn't impressed. "And do you have any formal education in it? I imagine someone with your background would have had a harder time breaking into the industry." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the heat rising to her face, the sting of David's words biting deep. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, fighting every day to prove that she deserved a seat at the table. But this judgment from someone she had barely met felt like a punch to the gut. Miles could sense the tension rising, and he interjected before Sophie had a chance to respond. "Dad, please," Miles said, his voice sharper than usual. "That's enough." David's expression tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he took a sip of his wine and turned his attention back to the table. Sophie's stomach twisted into knots, the silent pressure of the situation suffocating her. She wasn't sure if she could keep her composure much longer. As the meal progressed, the conversation shifted to other topics, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being examined under a microscope. Every glance, every question, felt like a test she wasn't prepared for. She felt herself shrinking into the chair, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, the words she couldn't speak stifling her. And then, just when Sophie thought she couldn't take it any longer, Miles's younger sister Lily spoke up. "I think Sophie's work is incredible," Lily said, her voice clear and unyielding. She turned to Sophie with a warm smile. "I've seen some of her paintings before, and they're breathtaking. I think art is about more than just how much money you can make. It's about making people feel something. Sophie does that." The words came as a surprise, cutting through the tension in the room like a breath of fresh air. Sophie looked at Lily, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time since walking into the house, someone here saw her for who she really was. David's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Sophie could feel the weight of the silence between them. She had made her presence known, at least for now. But would it be enough? As the dinner came to a close, Miles walked her out to the car, his arm around her shoulders. The cold night air hit her face as they stepped outside, but it felt like a relief compared to the suffocating atmosphere of the dinner. "Are you okay?" Miles asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Sophie looked up at him, her heart still racing. She wasn't sure how to answer. Words failed her once again, but as she gazed into his eyes, she knew one thing was certain. She was tired of fighting for her place in a world that didn't want her. But maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to fight it alone. The days after the family dinner passed in a blur of unease. Sophie had returned to her apartment that night, her head swirling with the conversations and the stares, especially David's dismissive tone. It was as if she didn't belong in their world, that she was an outsider, a blemish on the polished surface of their perfect lives. She hadn't realized how deeply the evening had affected her until she found herself standing in front of her easel, paintbrush in hand, yet unable to move. The room was quiet, save for the sound of her breath. The canvas in front of her remained stark white, mocking her inability to express herself the way she needed to. The silence in her apartment was nothing like the quiet she had shared with Miles, who made her feel seen, understood. But this silence, it felt suffocating, heavy with all the words she could never say. She stared at the blank canvas, the weight of it almost unbearable. She longed to put color to it, to bring out the emotions she had hidden for so long, but her hand shook too much. It had always been easier to hide behind the paintbrush, to let the colors speak what her lips could not. But now, every stroke felt wrong. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood, the memories flooding her like an overwhelming tide. She had been just a teenager when the accident happened. Sophie had been sitting in the passenger seat, her younger brother driving. The world had felt so full of possibility then. But everything changed in an instant. The crash had taken everything, her brother's life, her voice. Sophie gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into the wood as the memories hit her with a force that left her breathless. She hadn't spoken a word since the accident. Not a single sound had passed her lips, not out of choice, but because her body refused to let her. It was as if the trauma had locked everything inside and she had been unable to let it out. She had tried therapy, tried everything they said would help, but nothing worked. Words, spoken or written, felt inadequate, too fragile to bear the weight of her grief. So she turned to art. At least there, the silence made sense. A knock on the door broke her reverie. She wiped her eyes quickly, hoping the tears hadn't made it too obvious how fragile she felt. It was Miles. His face appeared at the doorframe, looking concerned. He had been checking on her for the past few days, sensing that something was off. His eyes softened when he saw her at the easel, paintbrush in hand, but still motionless. "Hey," he said gently, stepping into the room. "I thought I'd find you here." Sophie didn't speak, but she didn't have to. She pointed to the canvas, then to the floor, indicating that she couldn't seem to find the words or the strength to begin. Miles approached her slowly, not pressing her, but not letting her retreat either. He stood beside her, looking at the empty canvas. "You know," he began, his voice low, "there's no rush. You don't have to paint if it's not coming to you." Sophie took a deep breath. She had never been this open with anyone about what she felt, what she had been carrying. But something about Miles, the way he was looking at her, made her feel safe. She scribbled on the notepad she kept by the easel and slid it to him. "I lost my voice the day I lost him. I didn't choose it. I didn't ask for it. But it's mine now, and it's all I have left of him." Miles took the note and read it, his eyes softening as he absorbed her words. Sophie watched him carefully, waiting for the inevitable discomfort that always came when she shared her past. But instead, Miles just nodded, his hand reaching out to gently touch hers. "I can't imagine what that must have felt like," he said quietly. "But I'm here, Sophie. Whatever you need, I'm here, and I won't leave." Sophie's heart swelled, her throat tightening. She had expected pity or awkward silence, but instead, Miles had offered her something more precious, understanding and patience. Her eyes filled with tears, and she didn't try to stop them this time. She let them fall freely, a mixture of relief and sorrow. She had spent so many years thinking she was unworthy of real connection, too broken to ever truly be seen. But in this moment, with Miles beside her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She turned to him and spoke for the first time in what felt like forever. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky but real, "for seeing me." Miles squeezed her hand, his face soft but firm with resolve. "You're not invisible, Sophie. Not to me." And for the first time since the accident, Sophie believed him. The phone call came in the middle of the night, disrupting Sophie's quiet slumber. She had been resting, her mind finally allowing her a brief reprieve from the weight of everything, but the sharp ring of her phone shattered the calm. Sophie groggily reached for it, not expecting what would come next. "Miss Carver?" The voice on the other end was sharp and professional, but with an underlying urgency. "This is Sandra from the gallery. There's a problem. We've just learned that one of your pieces was mishandled. It's damaged. We need you to come in and assess the situation immediately." Sophie's heart dropped. She blinked, the fog of sleep clearing quickly as the words registered. Her art, the thing that had allowed her to speak when she couldn't, the thing she had poured so much of herself into, was damaged? A part of her felt sick as the reality of the situation sank in. The timing was almost cruel. After everything, the family dinner, the comments from David, the constant pressure she had been feeling to prove herself, it was as if the universe had decided to remind her of her limitations. She stood up from the bed, the cool night air hitting her skin as she glanced at the untouched canvas in the corner of the room. Her art had always been her escape, her way of coping with the loss, the silence, the grief. And now to have it destroyed, it felt like another blow she couldn't afford. She stared at the phone in her hand for a long moment, contemplating. She could cancel, pretend it wasn't happening, but Sophie knew better. Running from it wouldn't fix anything. She needed to face it. She needed to take control, no matter how broken she felt in the moment. Sophie arrived at the gallery an hour later, her hands trembling as she stepped into the familiar space that had once been her refuge. The staff greeted her, but their eyes seemed to avoid hers, a mixture of guilt and discomfort in the air. She was led to the back room where the damage had occurred. The gallery owner stood by one of her paintings, its frame cracked and a section of the canvas slashed, the tear jagged and irreparable. Sophie stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the sting of betrayal, but it wasn't just the piece itself. It was the thought of the people who would judge her now. Her art wasn't just about beauty. It was her story, her pain. And now, a part of that story had been destroyed. Her chest tightened as the voices of the gallery staff faded into the background. She could hardly breathe. The familiar feeling of suffocation crept back, reminding her of all the other moments when life had felt like it was slipping through her fingers. But this time, she didn't have a brush to hide behind. She didn't have her art to keep her grounded. She turned away from the damage, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't handle this, not alone. But just as she was about to leave, a familiar voice broke through the fog of her mind. "Sophie." She looked up to see Miles standing in the doorway, his face filled with concern. He had come after receiving a message from the gallery, not knowing what had happened, but already sensing her distress. He walked toward her, his presence grounding her, and she found herself finally able to breathe again. Hey, he said softly, placing his hand gently on her arm. "I'm here. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." Sophie blinked back tears, but they came anyway. She hadn't realized how much she needed him until that moment. For so long, she had carried her burdens in silence, not trusting anyone enough to share the weight. But Miles, he saw her. He didn't need her to speak, and that made all the difference. "I can't fix it," Sophie finally whispered, her voice breaking. She motioned toward the damaged canvas. It's ruined." Miles's eyes softened as he gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "No," he said firmly. "It's not ruined. You can fix it. You've always been able to fix things, through your art, through your strength. This is just another challenge. We'll face it together." Sophie took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself, but his words had pierced through the fog, reaching her in a way nothing else had. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She felt like she could breathe again. But as the tears continued to fall, Sophie realized something. The pain of the damage wasn't just about the art. It was the feeling of being powerless, the fear that everything she built could come crashing down in an instant. She had spent so long trying to keep herself together, not allowing herself to break. But now, in front of Miles with the gallery staff watching, she couldn't hold it in anymore. Miles's arms encircled her, pulling her into a tight embrace, and she finally let go. For the first time in years, Sophie allowed herself to be vulnerable. She let the pain and the fear flood out, and Miles held her through it all, not judging, just being there. For Sophie, that was enough. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was facing the world alone. Sophie hadn't planned on attending another event like this. Not so soon, not after everything that had happened with the gallery. But Miles insisted. He had been persistent, telling her it would be good for her, good for both of them. It was a charity gala, one of those high-profile affairs with glamorous guests and sharp-dressed philanthropists. For most people, it was just another night of mingling and posing for photos. For Sophie, it was a reminder of the world she didn't belong to, a world that felt as foreign to her as the silence she carried within. She wasn't sure what it was, whether it was Miles's constant support, the way he had been there through the mess of her art being destroyed, or simply the familiarity of his presence. But she was here, standing at the entrance of the event, holding his hand as the flashing cameras captured their every move. "Are you okay?" Miles asked, his voice soft in her ear as they moved through the crowd. Sophie nodded, offering him a faint smile, but inside, she felt the pressure rising. She was still unsure if this was a world she could truly be a part of. The wealthy, polished crowd seemed to take one glance at her quiet demeanor, her simple dress, and immediately dismiss her as an outsider. But she had Miles beside her. That was enough. She would survive tonight, just like she always had. The night wore on, and Sophie did her best to blend in. She didn't speak much, content to stay close to Miles, but she noticed the way people looked at her, whispering behind her back, their eyes occasionally flicking to her with judgment. The murmurs were hard to ignore. She had grown used to it, but tonight felt different. It was like they were waiting for her to mess up, waiting for her silence to be a reason to dismiss her altogether. But then, just when she thought she could make it through the evening unscathed, an all too familiar voice cut through the crowd. "Isn't that the silent artist?" Sophie froze, her eyes immediately locking onto the source of the voice. Standing across the room, a man she hadn't expected to see, let alone hear, was none other than Henry, her former business partner, the one person she thought she'd left behind when she distanced herself from the art world's more cutthroat side. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a designer suit, his sharp features twisted into a sly grin as he approached. "Henry," Sophie wrote quickly on the notepad she always kept with her, passing it over to Miles. Miles's eyes widened. "What's he doing here?" Sophie didn't know how to answer. All she knew was that Henry's presence here tonight, at this gala, was a reminder of everything she had worked to escape. The manipulation, the pressure, the constant sense of being used. He made his way over to them, his gaze never leaving Sophie. "I didn't expect to see you here, Sophie," he said with a thin, almost mocking smile. "You must be doing better than I thought." Sophie didn't reply, her eyes narrowing as she watched Henry's every movement. She didn't want to engage with him, not here, not now. But Henry was relentless, like he always had been. "Come on, don't be shy. The art world's not as forgiving as it seems," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You found your little niche, but trust me, Sophie, it won't last. People like you don't stay in the spotlight for long. Art's about making money, not feeling good about yourself." Miles stepped forward, positioning himself between Sophie and Henry, his expression hardening. "I think it's time for you to leave." Henry laughed, stepping back, clearly enjoying the discomfort he had caused. But just before he walked away, he threw a final cutting remark over his shoulder. "It's funny, isn't it, Miles? You and Sophie, so different, You've always been the one with everything, the golden child, and yet here you are with her, someone who can barely make a living off her art. You're wasting your time." Sophie could feel the sting of his words, even if she didn't react outwardly. Henry's betrayal went deeper than the art world. It went to the heart of her struggle, the quiet fight she had always waged against being seen as less than she was, against being dismissed for her silence, for her brokenness. Miles's hand found hers, his fingers lacing with hers tightly. "Ignore him," he whispered, his voice low but steady. "He's nothing but a bitter reminder of a world you don't need to be part of." But Sophie couldn't help it. Henry's words lingered, cutting through her resolve. She felt the weight of his judgment pressing against her chest, suffocating her. Was Miles truly different from everyone else? Was he just like them, ultimately? Was this relationship just another dream she would eventually wake up from? Just another part of the world that didn't have room for her? She looked at Miles, searching his eyes for the answers she couldn't find within herself. For the first time, she wasn't sure what was real anymore. The following days after the gala felt like a fog for Sophie. She could still hear Henry's words echoing in her mind. "You're wasting your time." It was as if they had left an indelible mark on her, something she couldn't wipe away. Every glance from someone in the art world, every quiet moment of judgment felt amplified. She began to question everything: her art, her place in the world, and even her relationship with Miles. Miles had noticed the change in her almost immediately. She had grown quieter, more withdrawn. He knew the scars of her past were never far from the surface, but seeing her retreat into herself again struck a chord deep within him. He didn't want to push her, but he couldn't stand watching her suffer in silence. One evening, after another long day spent avoiding eye contact and conversations, Miles found Sophie staring out of her apartment window. The same stillness that had initially drawn him to her now seemed like a shield, a barrier she had put up against the world. He hesitated at the doorframe, unsure how to break through. "Sophie?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant. She turned her head slightly, acknowledging his presence but not fully meeting his eyes. "Hi," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been distant," he said, stepping closer but giving her space. "What's going on? Talk to me." Sophie sighed, looking down at her hands still clenched tightly. She had been struggling with how to express what she felt. The weight of everything, the art, the gallery, the constant battle to prove her worth, had been suffocating her. She wasn't sure if she could keep going like this, pretending she was fine when she wasn't. I'm not enough," she said quietly, more to herself than to Miles. Miles's heart clenched as he heard the words fall from her lips. It hit him harder than he had anticipated. He had seen her strength, her passion for her art, but he hadn't fully understood just how deep her self-doubt ran. "Sophie, you're more than enough," he said gently, walking closer to her. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, I'm not. I'm not like everyone else. I don't fit in. I don't even have a voice. I'm just broken." Miles reached for her, taking her hands in his. "You're not broken. You've been through more than anyone should have to go through, and you've come out the other side stronger. You are enough. You are your voice. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Sophie blinked, her tears falling freely now. The weight of her self-doubt, the constant judgment she had felt, especially from her own family and the art world, had all poured out in that moment. She had been silent for so long, feeling unworthy of love, of respect. She thought she had to prove herself to others, but now, standing in front of Miles, she realized that maybe the only person she needed to prove something to was herself. "You're not the only one who feels like they're not enough," Miles continued, his voice steady. "I've been there too. I've spent so much of my life living up to other people's expectations. But you taught me something. You taught me that it's okay to be vulnerable, to not have everything figured out. I can't fix everything for you, but I can be here, and I will be. I'm not going anywhere." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes still wet but softened by the sincerity in his words. She had never been given the space to be truly vulnerable before, not even by her own family. But with Miles, She felt the safety she had longed for. A part of her wanted to pull away, to retreat into herself, but another part of her, a part she had buried for so long, wanted to reach out, to trust him completely. She squeezed his hands, her voice shaky but clear. "Thank you for seeing me." Miles smiled, his thumb gently brushing away the tears on her cheek. "I'll always see you, Sophie. You don't have to hide." For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt like she didn't have to carry the burden of silence alone. The darkness that had clouded her mind for so long began to lift, not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because she was finally allowing herself to believe that she was worthy of love, of acceptance, and of happiness. Miles took a step back, offering her a soft smile. "How about we take a walk? I think we could both use some fresh air." Sophie nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight on her shoulders ease just a little. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to be perfect. She just had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. And for once, she felt like that was enough. The weeks after their heart-to-heart had been a quiet sort of peace. Miles had taken to spending more time with Sophie, not rushing her, but patiently waiting for her to be ready to take the next steps in their relationship. There was no hurry, no pressure, just a steady presence in each other's lives. It was a contrast to the chaos Sophie had felt in the past, and it was beginning to feel right. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging doubt that always lurked in the back of her mind. Was she truly enough for someone like Miles? Miles had been everything she needed, kind, patient, understanding, but part of Sophie still feared that one day he would see through the cracks, see her for what she truly was, and walk away. But tonight felt different. Miles had invited her to dinner at his favorite restaurant, and when she arrived, he was waiting at the door with an expression she couldn't quite place. Nervous, maybe? Excited? "You look beautiful," he said, his voice soft as he opened the door for her. Sophie smiled, but she could sense something was off. Miles was usually confident, almost effortless in his charm, but tonight he seemed uncertain. As they sat down at their table, a cozy corner of the restaurant, Miles fiddled with his wine glass, his eyes avoiding hers more than usual. After a few moments of uncomfortable silence, he finally met her gaze, his expression serious. "Sophie, there's something I need to tell you." Her heart skipped a beat. Had something happened? Was there something wrong with them? She felt her stomach twist with anxiety, her fingers tightening around the edge of her napkin. "Miles, what's wrong?" He hesitated, looking down at the table before pushing a small velvet box across to her. Sophie blinked, not understanding. Was he? "I want to ask you something," Miles said, his voice steady but laced with a nervous undertone. "But I need you to know that this isn't just about a proposal. It's about everything we've been through, everything we've shared." Sophie's mind raced. The box was still there, and her pulse quickened as she opened it. Inside, nestled in deep blue velvet, was a simple, elegant ring, nothing extravagant but beautiful in its own understated way. She blinked, not quite understanding. "Miles, she began, but her voice faltered. The confusion, the questions, the deep vulnerability that had always lingered between them, it was all crashing down in that single moment. "I don't want you to feel pressured. I don't want to rush you into anything," Miles continued. "But Sophie, I love you. I love you more than I ever thought possible. And I want to build a future with you. I've never felt this way before, and I don't want to wait anymore." His words hit her like a tidal wave. They were everything she had wanted to hear, and yet the weight of them felt overwhelming. She had spent so much of her life holding herself back, afraid to let herself truly love, truly commit. The thought of taking that final step terrified her. But Miles wasn't giving up. He reached for her hand, gently holding it in his. "I know you're scared, I get it. But this isn't about being perfect. It's about being with someone who sees you, all of you, the good, the bad, the broken, and the beautiful. And I want that. I want us." Sophie felt the sting of tears, but she blinked them away. She had never allowed herself to fully believe in love, true, unshakable love. Not after all the pain, the loss, the years of silence that had kept her isolated. But here in this moment, with Miles's steady gaze locked on hers, she felt something shift. She felt like she could finally breathe, like she didn't have to hide anymore. "Miles," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve you." Miles shook his head, squeezing her hand. "You're wrong. You're everything I need." The world around them seemed to fade away as Sophie looked down at the ring, then back at Miles. Her heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She wasn't sure if she was ready, if she was enough, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to face her future without him by her side. "I don't know if I can give you everything you want," she said quietly, "but I'll try. I'll try for us." Miles smiled, his eyes softening. "That's all I need." The moment felt endless, yet it was perfect. Sophie couldn't promise the future would be easy. She couldn't promise that everything would fall into place. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was finally willing to try. She reached for the ring, and as Miles slid it onto her finger, everything she had feared, every doubt, began to melt away. This was real. She was ready. Sophie had always thought that life had a way of presenting the truth when it was ready to be revealed. But today, as she sat beside Miles in the small cafe near his office, she realized how wrong she had been. She hadn't been prepared for the storm that was about to hit. Miles had been acting a little off all day, distracted, distant in the way he was with her at times when his mind was preoccupied. Sophie couldn't quite place the shift, but she could feel it. As much as he reassured her that everything was fine, there was something about his eyes, his silence, that told her otherwise. "I need to talk to you about something," Miles said, breaking the quiet between them. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his words. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She set her coffee down slowly, her fingers tightening around the cup as she looked at him. "What's wrong?" she asked softly, her mind immediately racing. He sighed, rubbing his temples as if the words were hard to bring forth. "It's about my family, about something I should have told you a while ago." Sophie's chest tightened at his words. She had always known there was more to Miles than the surface he had shown her, something buried beneath the layers of success and ambition. But she hadn't expected him to open up about it now, not like this. "You can tell me anything," she said, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. "You know that." Miles met her gaze, his eyes full of both love and regret. "This is about my father," he started, his words deliberate, slow. "There's something I haven't told you about the family business. Something I've kept from everyone, including you." Sophie felt her heart drop. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but she could feel it taking a turn she wasn't prepared for. "What about your father?" she asked, trying to steady herself. "My father, David. He's been involved in something that you might not be happy to hear." Miles paused again, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. "There's a company, a rival tech company. He's been using my name to push them out of the market, and it's all based on something that, well, something I've been a part of too." Sophie blinked, trying to absorb what he was saying. She had heard snippets over the years about the fierce competition between tech companies, but never anything that felt personal, never anything that would reach into the space between them, into the trust they were building. "Miles, what are you saying?" Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper, her mind reeling. She hadn't realized that something so deep and dark had been lingering beneath their relationship. How could she? He had always been open with her, so why hadn't he told her this? "I didn't want to tell you this, Sophie," Miles said, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "I didn't want to involve you in something so ugly, especially not with everything you've been through. But I can't keep hiding it anymore. The company, it's not just competition. It's tied to a deeper problem, one that my father's been involved in for years. The kind of thing that could ruin both our reputations if it ever comes to light." Sophie's chest tightened as she pieced the words together. This wasn't just a corporate conflict. This was a betrayal, one that had the potential to shake everything she thought she knew about Miles, about their future. She couldn't ignore the feeling of panic rising within her. Her thoughts raced. How could she have missed something so monumental? Why hadn't he told her before? But then, as if the world had decided to push her over the edge, something inside her clicked. The fear, the shock, the uncertainty, they were all there. But beneath it, there was something else: clarity. She had been so focused on her own fears, her own insecurities, that she had never fully understood the weight of the world Miles carried. He had kept this secret to protect her, to shield her from a side of his life that might have broken them. But what did it mean now? How could they move forward knowing that the past, the shadows of their family's history, had begun to collide with their present? Sophie looked at him, her voice calm but steady. "You kept this from me because you were trying to protect me, didn't you?" Miles nodded, his eyes filled with both regret and relief. "I didn't want to hurt you, Sophie, but I know now that hiding it wasn't the answer. I should have told you sooner." Sophie sat back, her mind whirling. She had always prided herself on being independent, not needing anyone to fix her. But now, as she sat there realizing that the man she loved had carried this burden alone for so long, she realized how much she was willing to sacrifice to make this work. She had always struggled with the idea that love meant hiding pieces of yourself, but now she understood the complexity of what Miles had done and what he was offering her. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Miles, I don't know what this means for us yet, but I know one thing. We'll face it together. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out. But you have to be open with me. I can't be a part of this if you're still hiding things." Miles reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. "I promise, no more secrets. From now on, it's us." Sophie nodded, feeling a mix of emotions swirl within her. But one thing was clear: no matter the betrayal, no matter the obstacles ahead, they were in this together. The night was quieter than usual, the air thick with anticipation as Miles led Sophie through the park, their footsteps soft against the cobblestone path. It had been a week since their conversation, since everything between them had shifted once again. The revelations, the fears, the promises they had made to each other. It was all hanging in the air, still uncertain but full of possibility. Tonight, everything felt different. The tension, the weight of their pasts was somehow lighter. Sophie had been thinking a lot about their conversation, the secrets Miles had revealed about his family, the way he had opened up to her in a way no one ever had. She knew that they weren't out of the woods yet, that there would still be obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in a long while, Sophie felt like she wasn't alone. She felt like she could actually trust someone with all of her broken pieces. "Are you sure about this?" Miles asked, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. They stopped in front of a large oak tree, its branches stretching wide above them, the leaves rustling in the soft evening breeze. It was their spot, the place they had first shared their fears, their dreams, the place where Sophie had felt safe enough to let down her guard. Sophie nodded, looking up at him, her heart racing. She didn't know where this was leading, but she was no longer afraid. "I'm sure." Miles took a deep breath, and Sophie could see the vulnerability in his eyes. He had always been confident, always seemed to have everything figured out, but now in this moment, she saw him as he truly was. A man who had fought to protect everything he loved, even at the cost of his own truth. "I don't have a perfect way to say this," Miles began, stepping closer to her. "But I know what I want. I want you in my life, Sophie. I want to build something real with you. I don't want any more secrets between us. No more hiding." Sophie felt her pulse quicken as she listened to his words, her heart swelling with emotion she had buried for so long. She had never allowed herself to believe in something this pure, this real. But standing here with Miles, feeling the intensity of his words, she realized that she had never been more ready for anything in her life. "I want to be with you too," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "I've been so scared that I'm not enough, but I realize now that I don't need to be perfect. I just need to be with you." Miles smiled softly, his eyes lighting up as he reached into his pocket. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as he pulled out the small velvet box. Her heart raced, her hands trembling slightly as she saw the ring, simple yet elegant, something that reflected both of their quiet strength and the depth of their love. "Sophie," Miles said, his voice now barely more than a whisper, "will you marry me?" For a long moment, Sophie was silent, her mind spinning as she processed what was happening. The question felt surreal, and yet deep down, she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when she stopped running from her fears and embraced the future with someone who loved her for everything she was. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Miles, the man who had seen her, truly seen her, and loved her despite the silence, the pain, and the mess that was her past. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will." Miles let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, a look of pure relief washing over his face as he slid the ring onto her finger. Sophie couldn't stop the tears from falling, but they weren't tears of fear or doubt. They were tears of joy, of acceptance, of knowing that, for the first time, she didn't have to carry her burdens alone. Miles pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as they stood there, the night wrapping around them like a cocoon. In that moment, Sophie knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. "I love you," Miles said, his voice muffled against her hair. "I'll love you through everything, Sophie, no matter what." "I love you too," she replied, her voice shaking with emotion. "And I'm not going anywhere." They stood there for a long while, just holding each other, feeling the weight of everything they had shared and everything they would continue to share. Sophie had never imagined that love could be this real, this raw. But with Miles, she knew that they were finally writing their own story, one without fear, without doubt, one built on trust, love, and a promise to always fight for each other. The days after the proposal passed in a haze of joy and reflection. Sophie couldn't stop looking at the ring on her finger, its presence a constant reminder of the promise they had made. Each time she saw it, a wave of emotion washed over her, a mixture of relief, excitement, and even a little fear. But with Miles beside her, she felt like she could face anything. They had come so far together, and now there was nothing that felt impossible. It wasn't the grand gestures, the extravagant moments that made her heart swell. It was the small, everyday things. Like how Miles would make her coffee every morning without asking, how he would take her hand when they walked through the city, or the way he listened to her every word, as if what she said mattered more than anything else. The world outside had been chaotic, full of challenges and uncertainties, but Sophie was finally learning to trust that there was something stable between them. They had shared their secrets, their fears, and their pasts, and yet they had only grown closer. Miles had taken the time to truly understand her, to appreciate the strength in her silence, the depth in her art. And in return, Sophie had begun to open up, to embrace the love that she had been so afraid to accept. She wasn't just the woman with a quiet past. She was someone capable of love, of vulnerability, and of being loved in return. One morning, as the sun peeked through the curtains, Sophie found herself sitting on the edge of their bed, staring at the piece of art she had been working on for weeks. It was a reflection of everything she had been feeling, of the love she had found, of the fears she had conquered, of the beauty in embracing what was real. Miles had watched her work on it day after day, never pushing her but always there when she needed him. As she stepped back to admire the painting, a sense of peace settled over her. She had been afraid of putting her heart out there, of letting herself be seen. But now, standing in this moment, with the love of her life beside her and the future ahead of them, Sophie realized something important. She wasn't broken. She was whole, just as she was. Miles entered the room, his smile soft and knowing as he saw her standing there, lost in her thoughts. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting gently on her shoulder. "Morning, beautiful," he murmured, his voice warm. Sophie leaned back into him, feeling the comfort of his embrace. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft but steady. He glanced at the painting she had been working on, taking in the colors and the shapes. "This is amazing," he said, his voice full of admiration. "It's like you've finally let go of all the fear." Sophie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, "I think I finally have." Miles kissed her cheek, holding her close, I'm so proud of you, Sophie, for everything you've done, for everything you are." For the first time, Sophie didn't feel the need to hide. She didn't feel like she had to explain herself or apologize for her past. She knew that the person standing beside her, Miles, wasn't just seeing her for who she had been. He was seeing her for who she had become, and that was enough. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the future suddenly seemed so clear. There would be challenges, of course. Life was never without them. But with Miles, Sophie knew that they could face anything. They had already overcome so much together, and there was no reason to believe they wouldn't continue to grow, to learn, to build a life together. "I love you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Miles smiled, the kind of smile that made Sophie's heart race. "I love you too," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And in that moment, everything felt like it had fallen into place. The future, which once seemed so uncertain, now felt like a promise they would keep together. No more hiding, no more pretending to be something they were not. Just love. Real, true love. The days after their quiet, profound moment together felt like a gentle awakening. Sophie and Miles were no longer the versions of themselves they had been when they first met, uncertain, holding back, afraid of the pain they carried. Now they were something new. Two people who had faced their pasts, learned from their struggles, and decided that love was worth fighting for. As the weeks went by, things began to fall into place in ways neither of them could have anticipated. They had started making plans, simple things at first, like weekend trips to the coast, dinner dates with their friends, and quiet evenings at home. There were no grand declarations, no over-the-top gestures, just the comfort of routine and the knowledge that they were building something real. Sophie was painting again, but this time her work felt freer, unburdened by the weight of her fears. The art was no longer a way of hiding from the world. It had become a form of expression, a way for her to show the world who she was, without apology. Her latest piece was a vibrant explosion of color, bold and full of life. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was her, and for the first time, that was enough. Miles watched her work, admiring not just the finished piece, but the process itself. He had always respected her art, but now, seeing how much of herself she poured into it, he had a deeper understanding of her strength. He knew the road to this moment hadn't been easy for her, but here she was, standing in her own power, ready to embrace the future with him by her side. One evening, as they sat on the couch after dinner, Sophie rested her head on his shoulder, a soft smile playing on her lips. Miles kissed the top of her head, pulling her closer. "You know," he said quietly, "I still can't believe how lucky I am to have you in my life." Sophie tilted her head, looking up at him. "Why? Because I'm an artist who doesn't speak?" she teased, her voice warm. Miles chuckled, his hand gently brushing her cheek. "Because you're everything I never knew I needed. You've taught me so much about myself, about love, about being real." Sophie's heart swelled at his words, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe them. She wasn't just a quiet woman, a mute artist. She was someone worthy of love, someone who had the strength to heal and grow, and she wasn't alone. "I never thought I'd get here," she said softly. "I never thought I'd let anyone in this much. And I never thought I'd find someone who sees me for who I really am," Miles replied, his voice filled with emotion. "I think we've both spent so much time hiding from the world. But now, together, we don't have to anymore." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. It wasn't just a dream anymore. It was their reality. The future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. "I'm ready," Sophie said, her voice filled with conviction. "Ready to step into the world as me, ready to love and be loved without holding back." Miles smiled, his heart full as he cupped her face in his hands. "We've already begun, Sophie. We've already started. And no matter what comes next, we'll face it together." Sophie leaned into him, her heart at peace. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. There would be more obstacles, more challenges, but together, they could conquer anything. She knew with certainty now that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about the willingness to be vulnerable, to share your heart, and to trust that the person standing beside you would hold it gently, even when the world tried to break it. And with Miles, she felt that trust. She felt the safety of knowing that they would face the future hand in hand, no longer afraid of the past, but ready to build something new, a future full of hope, love, and endless possibilities. What do you think of Sophie and Miles's journey? Were their actions enough to overcome their pasts, or do you think they still have a long way to go? Share your thoughts in the comments below. From 0 to 10, what's your score for this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on all our stories. And make sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.